सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Hidden away in the inside pages of the Indian Express today is a gem. A very fine story written by veteran journalist P. Raman. Senior journalist, in fact senior even to me, at the Indian Express. This is a story about a 105-year-old man who passed away in New Delhi, in fact in East Delhi Samachar Apartments, just a couple of days ago, that is Monday this week. His name was MC Dikshit. MC Dikshit, who passed away at 105, actually was a pilot. Now the passing away of MC Dikshit and this story takes us back to something, to history of cloak and dagger, espionage, spying, dirty tricks, double Cold War, a Cold War supplanted over another Cold War, right back to 11th of April 1955, that far back. And you know what? While this story takes us back to 11 April 1955, it also reminds us of problems that endure, or the issues that endure. So the three issues critical to the story that we are talking about, and the reason why this story is so interesting right now, the three issues were: one, non-aligned movement; number two, Taiwan and the Taiwan challenge, right, for the big powers in the West and China and for Taiwan itself; and third, Hong Kong and the status of Hong Kong. Now, all three still keep making headlines, and all three in many ways still determine how global politics runs. Because right now we may be focused on Europe, but we know that in future, if at all there will be a conflict or tension or a new Cold War, it will be between the US and its Western allies and China. So go right back to 11 April 1955. What happened then, and what was Mr. MC Dikshit doing then? MC Dikshit, who passed away at 105 last Monday. And why does his passing away become such a landmark, such a milestone? Now, MC Dikshit was then a young pilot. He was the co-pilot of an Air India aircraft called Kashmir Princess. Kashmir Princess was a Lockheed Constellation aircraft, 4-engine propeller aircraft. Those were sort of the long-haul aircraft those days. This was an Air India aircraft, but right now it was not on scheduled Air India duty. It was on a charter duty, and it had taken off from Hong Kong. It took off from Hong Kong at 1:23 p.m. in the afternoon. About 3 hours later, it crashed in South China Sea, not far from Indonesian waters. In fact, near an island called Natuna Island. There it crashed. Now, why did it crash? It crashed because somebody had planted a bomb on it. That's what came out later. Now, who had planted the bomb is an important point, but for whom was the bomb planted is even more important. The bomb was planted for Zhou Enlai. Now, Zhou Enlai, as the plane went down, as the bomb went off, as investigations later showed, the bomb had been placed in the starboard wheel well. That's on the right side, where the wheels go up as the undercarriage is retracted. That is where the bomb was planted. So as the aircraft went down, 16 people died. 11 passengers, they were all Chinese, important Chinese, but not the most important ones who were the target. 11 Chinese died, 5 crew members died, including the captain, D.K. Jatar. He also died, but the co-pilot, that was MC Dikshit, he survived, as did 2 others. So 2 others who survived were the navigator, J.C. Pathak, and also mechanical engineer on the flight, A.S. Karnik. These 3 members of the crew survived. These members of the crew were apparently in the cockpit. All the others perished. Now, what was the backstory? The backstory was that later that month, on the 18th, the big Bandung conference was taking place. Now, Bandung conference, which ultimately 29 countries attended, this was the big Afro-Asian Jamghat, and the Chinese were participating in it. And this was seen as rising as a challenge to the Western powers on the one hand, and the Soviet power on the other. So there was a Cold War on between the Soviet bloc and the American bloc, Western bloc, and this new force was rising. So Bandung Conference was important. In fact, it is Bandung Conference which then passed a 10-point declaration after that, which ultimately became a kind of seed for the formal launch of the non-aligned movement in 1961. Now, Bandung Conference and this get-together was something that had caused a great deal of anxiety for Western powers. So while it had caused anxiety for Western powers, it had also caused anxiety for Taiwan. So I told you this takes us back to three crucial elements. Non-aligned movement, which was now a source of anxiety for Western powers, particularly because the Chinese were also participating in it and Zhou Enlai was coming to participate in it. Second, it caused a great deal of consternation for Taiwan because Taiwan was still very new. Chiang Kai-shek, the dictator, was still ruling there. So the question was, who's the real China? Taiwan at that point had the permanent membership of United Nations because P5, the 5 permanent members, were those who were seen as the biggest victors of World War II. So they had China's place. So again, Chiang Kai-shek had a concern that, look, Zhou Enlai's stature is rising in the world. Now he will go for this big conference. He will be seen as a statesman globally. And that might strengthen the case of PRC or People's Republic of China for the permanent seat on United Nations Security Council, taking it away from Taiwan, because the question was, who's the real Taiwan? Before that, it looked like Zhou Enlai's stature was really rising in the non-Western world because he had gone to Geneva, John Foster Dulles, the US Secretary of State, such as he was, because he was quite notorious, quite aggressive, not the friendliest guy. He's the one American Republican even Churchill detested. So Churchill famously or infamously described him as dull, duller, Dulles. So Dulles it was who refused to shake hands with Zhou Enlai in Geneva. And that act of not shaking hands in public and rebuffing Zhou Enlai actually enhanced the stature of Zhou Enlai in the non-Western world. And then at the same time, the British, you can trust them to always do these things, they had reached out to the Chinese, and the British-Chinese relationship had thawed, and Sir Anthony Eden, the British Prime Minister, had met Zhou Enlai, and the British were now enhancing their contact with Red China or Communist China. That had caused a great deal of anxiety for Chiang Kai-shek and Taiwan. So they had to do something about the fact that Zhou Enlai was now going to Bandung. Now, Zhou Enlai was going to Bandung, so Zhou Enlai was worried and the Chinese were worried because how do they fly to Bandung? They were a little bit untrusting of their own aircraft, etc., because, they could be treated as hostile by somebody. So he wanted to fly in a more neutral aircraft. He was very friendly with Nehru. So once again, this takes you back to an era when India and China were such friends that they trusted each other with their lives. So Zhou Enlai talked to Nehru and Nehru agreed to lend one of the Air India aircraft. So Chinese government chartered an Air India aircraft. That was the super constellation named Kashmir Princess. So that aircraft was sent as a charter. So it went from Delhi to Bangkok, from Bangkok to Hong Kong. At Hong Kong, it had to wait for Zhou Enlai to come in because technically Hong Kong was Chinese territory, right? Zhou Enlai would have come in with this delegation and this plane would have then brought Zhou Enlai and his delegation from Hong Kong to Bandung. Now, from where do we have all this detail? We have this detail not just from the media. There's a lot published in international media and sometimes a little bit in international media also. There's also deep research stuff available on chinaproject.org. So we rely on that. Plus the Chinese government declassified in 2005 a lot of their selected documents from 1949 until 2005. And some of those documents tell us this story. So because Zhou Enlai was to go on this plane, the CIA and Chiang Kai-shek's government, they plotted his assassination. Now they figured that one, it will be very difficult to get close to him because he'll be very well protected. Second, his delegation will be very well protected. And third, it would be impossible to access him directly or the baggage that his delegation was carrying. That, by the way, was 37 boxes and that was recovered intact from the wreckage of the aircraft from the seas and handed back to the Chinese authorities later, but that's an aside. They also knew where the aircraft is parked at Kai-tak Airport in Hong Kong. Are you old enough to remember Kai-tak Airport? That was the airport right in Hong Kong Island. It was very small. It was surrounded by very crowded areas. In fact, the story used to be that when you come in to land at Kai-tak at a slow speed, you can pretty much count the pieces of laundry hanging on people's clotheslines and maybe even check out the size of people's underwear. That's a joke. But it used to be quite a hairy ride into Kai-tak. So this plane was to land and take off from Kai-tak after about an hour and a half's halt. Now, during that halt, who was going to be handling that aircraft? Now, the aircraft was going to be handled not by Hong Kong authorities. It was to be handled by mainland China's China Travel Service. So once again, you didn't have access to it. So what they did was, they found access to an engineer, Zhou, who was of Taiwanese origin. It seems like they paid him a bunch of money, and how much we realized later, and I will tell you how. They paid him a bunch of money to plant that bomb in the aircraft, and that is how that bomb was planted. But you know what? Zhou Enlai, his intelligence also had sources in Taiwan and Hong Kong. So they suspected, they got wind of it. So at the last moment, Zhou Enlai decided not to come. He did not come. The saboteurs thought that he was on the plane, and so they planted the bomb on the plane, and the plane then blew up and crashed. As the plane blew up and crashed, the captain, the co-pilot, other crew kept their nerve. So instead of just going into panic, they kept on steering the plane. They found the best possible spot in the water to ditch the plane, and they thought they will escape from the plane with life vests. But it so happened that when the plane hit the water, the plane broke up. So all those in the fuselage and in the tail died. But those in the front cabin, some of them survived. So 3 of them survived. So three survivors then were co-pilot MC Dikshit, navigator J.C. Pathak, and mechanical engineer A.S. Karnik. These three survived. In fact, A.S. Karnik featured in headlines a few years earlier when Hong Kong-based South China Morning Post carried a story saying how the Chinese embassy in India had honored him for his act of bravery. He was 82 now. This is in 2005. He was given a reward by the Chinese embassy of 50,000 rupees, and the Chinese ambassador then to India, Sun Yuxi, he wrote a letter in which he said, "I'm deeply moved by your heroic deeds and extraordinary experience." Now, this had come after Karnik had written to the Chinese ambassador saying that government of India had promised him an allowance in 1972, but he never got it. So he got this money from the Chinese, and the Chinese said they will hold a reception in Pune to honor him, etc., etc. But the story sort of appeared and was lost. It wasn't picked up. Now take your mind back to 1955. 1954, the big Taiwan Strait crisis has taken place. Korean War has just ended. The Americans have had a bloody nose in the Korean War. So Taiwanese are worrying that the Americans will not come to their aid. In this case, by 1954-55, Taiwan's concern and Chiang Kai-shek's concern is not surviving as an island state. His concern is to become the real China. And he's worrying that the Americans now, while they are protecting Taiwan by treaty, but they are not so invested in defeating all of Red China for Taiwan's sake. And the British at the same time are going and cozying up to China. So China is becoming the real China. What do I do? And then the idea was, if you can somehow bump Zhou Enlai off, that will be very useful. And that's how this plot was made. Now, the plot, as we know, the plot failed to the extent that the plane was blown up. Zhou Enlai was not on the plane. Zhou Enlai was clever. He still did not fly his own country's plane. He accepted another offer from U Nu, who was then the president of Burma, and flew on his plane. So U Nu sent his government's plane, on which he flew to Rangoon, and from Rangoon he came to Bandung. And Bandung is where the Nehru was there, Nasser was there, and that's where, as I told you, non-aligned movement was founded. Now, this story doesn't end here, because none of these stories in Cold War times ended right then. They always were a case of one thing leading to another. So among the many things this story led to was also the rise of India's greatest spy master of all times, that is Ramnath Kao, R.N. Kao. So you might ask me, what was R.N. Kao doing in all this? He must have been a very young man then. R.N. Kao was born in 1918. So he was 37 years old in 1955. He was present in Bandung with Nehru because he also, besides other things, used to look after what then passed off for VVIP security. Now there, because this plane had been blown up, this plane crash had taken place, Zhou Enlai wanted a better investigation, good investigation into how this had happened. Now the Chinese at that point did not have access to most parts of the world. So he sought Nehru's help, and Nehru then assigned R.N. Kao to investigate this. So you read these stories, you can read Nitin Gokhale's book on R.N. Kao, you can read other accounts. So R.N. Kao then lands up in Beijing as a 37-year-old and is given one-on-one audiences by none else than Zhou Enlai. So he investigates here. Zhou Enlai tries to convince him that this was a plot by Kuomintang. Kuomintang was the name of the political party or the ideology that Chiang Kai-shek led. He went to, then Kao from Beijing went to Hong Kong. Now this was very complicated because his plane was Indian. Most of the passengers who died were Chinese. In fact, the Chinese government officials, they were Zhou Enlai's delegation. The territory where the plane took off was Chinese owned but British administered, right? And powers behind this were Kuomintang, the Taiwanese, and the Americans. And that was a real dog's breakfast as an investigation. So he spent several months traveling between Hong Kong, Beijing, etc. Obviously, Indian officials did not have access to Taiwan. And then he put the story back together. And when he took the story back together, by September 1955, after several months of painstaking investigation across countries, he came to the conclusion that he had cracked the story. And he had a message sent to Zhou Enlai, who then had him again invited to Beijing. And there he established that it was a man called Zhao Zhu. Now he spell his names in different ways because Chinese spellings, the method of Chinese spellings keeps changing over time. The latest spelling I read is Zhao Zhu. That is Zhouju. So Zhao Zhu, who was a Taiwanese origin engineer but was also a Kuomintang sympathizer, he had agreed to plant this bomb in the plane for a payment then of $600,000. In fact, to give credit where it's due, the first time the story was elaborated like this in this detail was in a paper written by scholar Steve Tsang in 1994 in an issue of the China Quarterly. So to give the credit where it's due, the first time the story was unraveled later for people like us or for posterity was when a scholar called Steve Tsang wrote a paper in 1994 headlined Target Zhou Enlai in the China Quarterly. Now, R.N. Kao with this became a kind of a global star because he's somebody who at the age of 37 had gone from country to country, had met their intelligence chiefs, etc., etc. Now you might ask me, what happened to Zhao Zhu? Zhao Zhu, the moment the Americans and the British authorities in Hong Kong figured out that R.N. Kao was figuring out who was the guilty party, CIA, as you would expect, arranged for an aircraft to have Zhao Zhu flown out of Hong Kong into Taiwan. And that story then got lost there. There is also a poignant story linked to this, which is about Captain D.K. Jattar and flight stewardess Gloria Berry. Now, Captain Jattar figured that his plane was in trouble, that a bomb had gone off. So instead of losing nerve, he kept on calming everybody, trying to control the plane as much as he could, and looking for a safer spot for ditching the aircraft. Now, how do we know what he did? That's because he was awarded Ashok Chakra posthumously. Ashok Chakra, as we know, is India's highest gallantry award in peacetime, the peacetime equivalent of the Paramveer Chakra. So he got the Ashok Chakra. And see the citation. I found the citation in the archives. So please see the citation. It's a bit fuzzy because it was something that was typed in 1955. It says that while his plane was stricken, he was cool and unperturbed. He was not in panic. He did not allow any panic or confusion. He actually calmed everyone down and instantaneously stabilized the aircraft and chose an accurate and correct place for ditching the aircraft. His selection of the spot was brilliant. Unfortunately, he did not survive. So the stewardess, Gloria Berry, what did she do? She figured what was happening. So she was then picking up life vests and giving them to everybody, passengers and the crew. She didn't think of putting one on herself first because there was so little time. She was first looking after them and in the cockpit because she knew that cockpit crew had to manage the aircraft and they had no time to put on their life vests because they were wrestling with their controls. She put life vests onto them. And it's because she put life vests onto them that 3 of them survived to tell the tale. Gloria Berry was awarded Kirti Chakra, which is the second highest gallantry award in peacetime. So much before Neerja Bhanot of Pan Am, there was also Gloria Berry of Air India. So the story is about these two. We have from these fuzzy citations, and all 3 who survived owe their lives in a way to the 2 of them, particularly to Gloria Berry. Now, because we are talking about this, I cannot but mention about 2 more things. Now, Kashmir Princess went down in 1955. Before that, another Air India aircraft, another super constellation, that was named Malabar Princess, that had gone down hitting Mont Blanc while making its descent towards Paris. And it's one of those bizarre coincidences. In 1966, in January of 1966, exactly at the same spot, maybe a few hundred meters away from the same spot, bigger plane, 707, that is Air India 101 Kanchenjunga, that went down at the same spot. And that is the plane that carried our top atomic scientist and national hero, Homi Bhabha. So I thought because I mentioned one, I should mention the other 2 also. And you know what? All of this was the era of the Cold War, cloak and dagger, skullduggery. So nobody still knows what exactly happened when. Archives will come out, wreckages will come out, and dead people ultimately will tell the tale, as they have done in the case of this Kashmir Princess crash.